Well, in the movie, The Village, a group of men and women who had corresponded through grief counseling sought refuge from the brokenness of the world. And together, this group that had sought grief counseling, together built a remote village out in Pennsylvania. They were intentionally surrounded by dense forest. And the goal of the elders that they formed, the group counseling, was to escape the violence and to escape the tragedy that had so personally affected each one of them. But in their efforts to force the ignorant that had come and subsequent generations to stay in that village, a tragedy struck. And one of the original group members, who, again, an elder, makes the startling conclusion: we cannot run from heartache. My brother was slain in the towns. The rest of my family died here. Heartache is a part of life. We know that now. Ivy is running toward hope. Let her run. And you know, as I thought about that quote from that movie, it really struck me. It stayed with me. Because quite honestly, before becoming a pastor, I was really unfamiliar with death. And now, about 5 years later, I stand here all too accustomed to this one sound in the hospital room, the dull hum of that breathing device. Death is a horrific reality. And I think I can speak for all of us. We know that all too well. We know, right, that the saint may peaceably fall asleep one last time. But the pain and the sorrow seldom leave those who are left behind in this world. But peace is part of the Christian message. We just lit the candle of peace. And we talk so much in the Christmas celebration about peace. But when we look at the world around us, just as I talked about this reality of death, we live in this difficulty, don't we? This seemingly contradiction. We talk about peace, and we also know that there is death. And so, appropriate, this message is peace. What peace? What peace? Well, in a very strange twist, the Purim of Esthers chapter 8 and 9 speaks into this very discrepancy. Maybe in our chaos, maybe in the chaos of our world, that is where God brings his peace. Well, let me start as we look to the Bible right now, and I'm starting with verses just 1 and 2 of chapter 8. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. We'll stop for a minute there. And now, is it vital of importance in Esther 8 to be aware of two settings? There's actually two settings going on, and the differences between these two settings. In the verses that I just read, verses 1 and 2, we will focus on the palace, once again, of King Xerxes. You recall how much of this book has revolved around what happens in the palace: King Xerxes, Haman, Esther, and Mordecai. Now, that's one setting. Another setting in this chapter, of chapter 8, is the empire, and particularly the Jews of the empire as a whole. So it's important to keep in mind these two different settings. So in the palace, we go to the palace. And in the palace, things start out very well, honestly, for Esther and Mordecai here in chapter 8. Because without any prompting, King Xerxes hands over, you remember, evil, vile Haman, his entire estate, now that he is gone, he has been hanged, to his queen. And interestingly, Persian law dictated that the state could confiscate property of those who were deemed criminals, who had been condemned. And so Xerxes put it upon himself to take Haman's estate and do something with it. Now, while not as opulent as the king's palace, we are led to imagine Haman's estate of large acreage, adorned with fountains, beautiful floral gardens, sophisticated architecture. It was, if you will, the Persian mansion of its time. Mordecai, we see, is also honored. And that Mordecai was welcomed into the king's presence that we read there is interesting, right? Because you know, of course, that it was a big deal to be welcomed into the king's presence. We've talked about that. And the fact that Mordecai was given the signet ring that Haman had before tells us that Mordecai has taken over Haman's place in the kingdom. He has taken over his rightful place, because honestly, we remember back at the end of chapter 2, and really Mordecai should have been second in charge all along. Now Esther, for her part, does not claim Haman's property for herself, which is very interesting. I think we think of a lot of words to describe Esther. Maybe generosity wasn't one that we typically think of, but I think Esther shows herself to be a generous person here. Like the signet ring, Haman's property now falls to Mordecai, his rival. I mean, what a turn. Can you believe all that has taken place in Esther? All the turn from Haman to Mordecai is really eye-opening. Now, for all Esther and Mordecai have been through, and we've been through this journey, haven't we, over the weeks? It was a welcome relief, all that they've been through. But there is something in these verses that is actually bigger than either Esther or Mordecai. As we are to see the reversal of Mordecai's fate that befalls Haman as pointing ultimately to the cross. You remember the pole that was set up? That points to Jesus Christ, who took our place by dying in our place on that cross. So we should see Mordecai's glory as a foreshadowing of the glory of Jesus Christ. You see, so the parallel is really something here. It points to the glory of Jesus in heaven. As we read from Paul in Philippians chapter 2, Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. But then Paul says, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that in the name of Jesus every knee should bow, whether in heaven or on earth or under the earth. And so what we see happening to Mordecai, this glory that he is receiving now as second in charge, we see in much greater measure to Jesus Christ in glory. What a beautiful connection. But there's a problem here. If we stopped here, there's a looming problem. It's a big problem. Because as you remember, right, the edict, none of the circumstances have changed for the Jews living outside the palace walls. Well, they may be glad, they may be happy for Mordecai, and maybe there's even a sense of hope that Mordecai brings, but fear and doubt in the shadow of an imminent massacre loom large. I mean, the edict of Haman may be gone, but that edict is still very much in play. Like us, living today, the Jews of Persia live in between two existences. Because on the one hand, they can look back, and I'm certain that they did. They could look back and be reminded of God's faithfulness. Jews, through subsequent generation after generation, had told one another orally about God's faithfulness. I mean, they could recall God's deeds of the Passover and tabernacle, all of the glory of Jesus, of God himself. And looking forward, they may actually see glimpses of a hope, right, of a future. They could see Mordecai's triumph as a sign of hope for them. But in the present day, God's people, whether the Jews in Persia at this point or us, we are trudging along through life. We are altogether a people burdened today by loss, by grief, by confusion. And I think maybe you feel this way. I certainly do. There are times of wondering, oh God, when will it be over? When will this life of suffering and struggle end? When will we see the end of it? Well, thankfully, neither Esther and Mordecai, nor especially our God, abandoned their people. God does not abandon you. He does not abandon me. So we again go to the text and reading verses 3 to 8. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised, and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name, on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. Well, at this stage, we begin with verse 3, where Esther is once again in need of making a request to the king. And everything Esther has requested of the king, if we think back to this story, and it's kind of remarkable when you think about it, everything that Esther has requested of King Xerxes, she's gotten. She's been granted everything so far. And as we come to yet another instance of Esther making a request, we might be a little bit tempted to think that Esther, she's got nothing to worry about. I mean, think about what she's had to overcome already. She went before the king unannounced, illegally. She's now asked for Haman, something to be done to Haman. We might be tempted to think, oh, it's smooth sailing for her now, right? Well, that would be what we would call a false sense of security. As this video that we will now show, it may be taking place in England in the Middle Ages, but this video shows where a woman makes a plea before a king, and it is something that we should never take lightly. You got that, John? Thank you. Give it a second. That's all right. It's all right. We'll keep going. I was playing in case. Well, and, just to kind of. No, that's okay. That'll be the wrong one. It's all right, John. I was prepared. In this video, though, this young lady asked for a plea on behalf of her father, who was about to be sent to the gallows, and the king, basically, in summary view, looks over at this girl's brother, who's 16 years old. And the king asks the brother, how old are you? And basically says, you will be in service to the king as in a sense, a sign of loyalty to England, because the father had been a traitor. And the woman continues to plead on behalf of her father, and the king simply says, no, hang him. So again, it was this sense of, even when she's making a plea with the king, and you got this sense early on in the video that maybe the king would be merciful, but we see that, no, it wasn't in his self-interest, so he let the father pass away. And Esther would have to face, similarly, the self-interest of a king and the difficulty that a woman historically faced, right, in these societies of male nobility. And she's certainly, looking at the text again, so we look at it, she goes before the king and she's pleading with him, but she's also weeping. There's a sense of weeping there going on at his feet. Of course, I'm reminded with Esther at least, she used the greatest water power known to man, right? Her tears. In truth, she, like Jesus, weep over the threat of death. I think it's appropriate that when we see death, when we experience the death of others, it invites us to weep. We can be as Jesus and weep. And I think at such a time as this, we can empathize, can't we, with her plight, with seeing her people, and the threat that looms. Well, looking at verse 4, King Xerxes again extends his gold scepter. However, and this is key, because this is not exactly what had been happening before repeated, because this happens only after the queen makes her plea this time, and she's lying prostrate at his feet. With Haman gone, There was no reason to approach the king unannounced. So that's not the same thing. We are led to believe that Esther has gone through proper protocol to make an appearance with the king this time. So then we ask, well, what is going on? Why does he have to send the gold scepter? Why does he extend it? Well, based on verses 5 and 6, I believe Xerxes is encouraging her to rise and to make her request. In other words, he's kind of assuring her that he will listen and he will hear her request. So respectfully, and that's key, she does so very respectfully and bravely, Esther seeks for the king to revoke the edict Haman devised and wrote concerning the Jews. In these verses, it's really wonderful how Esther continues to show such impressive wisdom. Because first she asks several rhetorical questions. We see that in verse 6. She asks rhetorical questions, making an appeal to what is known as common ground. Making an argument where you're saying, we can understand one another on these things. The king should certainly be able to understand having a sympathy, an empathy towards other family members and your people. As a king, he would understand those things. And that's wise of her to use that tactic to say, I care about my people just like you, king. Second, and this is also very wise of Esther, she lays the blame for the edict solely on Haman. She never mentions that Xerxes has a certain share of guilt, and certainly he was equally culpable. And yet she does not put the blame on him. But unfortunately, what she is asking is impossible, remember? That no law that was written in the king's name can be revoked. She is asking for Haman's edict to be revoked. It can't happen. Not to mention that there is no appeal to the king's self-interest. And so we are left kind of in this tension at this point. Would the king outrightly refuse her request? Because that would be the easy thing. That would be the easy choice for the king. There's a lot of reasons why this wouldn't be all that appealing to King Xerxes. So the easy choice for the king would be to say, no, I can't revoke it, and it does me no good, so no. And maybe, just maybe, you are here wondering if Jesus, who is our king, will easily refuse your request, your hope for forgiveness, your need for association with the Prince of Peace. As the list of names in prayer these days grows longer and longer, maybe you are here today and you are concerned that the King of Kings doesn't really care, doesn't really have a care for what you need or the people around you. We've been going through a book called Gentle and Lowly in our discipleship group. And Elder Dane Orland writes, and I think these words are so good for all of us to hear today. Our tendency is to feel intuitively that the more difficult life gets, the more alone we are. But the Bible corrects us. Our pain never outstrips what Jesus shares in. We are never alone. That sorrow that feels so isolating, so unique, was endured by him in the past and is now being shouldered by him in the present. I hope that can encourage you, because those words have been so encouraging to me, that no matter what Xerxes answers here, we, as a people who answer to a king in Jesus Christ, can know that we worship a king who shares in solidarity with us, that he empathizes with us, that he has gone and stooped down to our level, and he has lived that perfect life. That invites us to approach Jesus' throne with confidence because he values you so dearly, dear ones. He values and he hears and he answers and he heals because he has the power to do so. Now going back to the text, despite his many flaws, King Xerxes here, in this instance, acts with humane compassion. And it's almost a little surprising, the answer that he gives. He permits his queen, and by extension Mordecai, to write another decree in the king's name, on behalf of the Jews as seems best to you. He reminds Esther that a document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring cannot be revoked, explaining why this must be the way forward. You see, if they can't erase the negative of Haman's edict, For those of you who are engineers in the room, you'll appreciate this. Perhaps a negative and a negative can produce a positive. While we continue again in the text, reading from verse 9. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews, and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province, and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers, who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them, and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses raced out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was also issued in the citadel of Susa. Well, in the midst of what we would believe to be a hot Persian summer, it would get quite hot. It is, of course, present-day Iran. Mordecai sent written orders to every province. And the messenger carriers rode hand-picked royal horses that were especially bred for their speed. And since UPS has shown to be one of the faster delivery services, I thought maybe for a memorable basis we call them UPS horses. What can Brown do for you? So the UPS horses had to reach across an extensive empire, and their swiftness then was vital. I mean, we talked from the first week about how massive the Persian Empire was. Of equal significance is that these orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people. You see, an attack against the Jewish people would no longer be an ambush. Every Jew was going to be made aware. Every Jew was going to be prepared that now legally they would be enabled to defend their homes, to defend their lives. Every language was no longer ignorant of this edict. In fact, and I think it's for some of us maybe a little bit difficult, there is some stunning similarity between Haman's and Mordecai's edicts. Now, the Edict of Mordecai, we'll call it that, the Edict of Mordecai, you see that in verses 11 and 12. As opposed to some translations, I think the Hebrew really conveys the sense that it permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives. That's key. To destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. So what this says is that, yes, as hard as it is for us to hear, the Jews were permitted to respond to the violence with violence. And again, while this may be difficult for our ears to hear, I do believe that two truths need to be emphasized about this edict. First is that the edict clearly stipulates that the Jew would only respond with force if they were threatened. That is very important, if they were threatened. In other words, they were not to take action in an offensive way against the people of the empire. They were only to respond to violence with protecting themselves, to defend their lives, we see the text say, that might attack them. This edict, again, provided a legal protection for self-defense. You know, it's interesting that one of the key discussions in church history revolved around when it might be appropriate for Christians to enact self-defense or to wage war. The early church father Augustine effectively argued that peace is not sought to provoke war, but war is waged to attain peace. Now, if Augustine is right, then the Jews' permission to wage a temporary war of self-defense would ironically then be the ultimate means of making peace. Because this is where it's so key that we differentiate between keeping peace and making peace where there is not. Second, There's an argument that though the edict allowed for self-defense against anyone, only the men who attacked were actually killed. Now we'll talk about that. There's some evidence of that in Esther 9, but again, we will have to wait until next week to continue on that discussion. Ultimately, as we looked at Esther 8 in a whole way, it's hard, I think, to see peace in this chapter. And truthfully, it's hard to see peace during this life on earth, isn't it? During this pandemic, I think a lot of us don't feel a lot of peace. Peace? What peace? But then I got to thinking about this season. And I think of all the seasons that we have talked and I have preached through the Advent message of Jesus' birth. You know something? If you look closely at the context of Jesus' birth, it is very difficult to find peace surrounding that tiny little hamlet of Bethlehem. You think about the oppression of the Roman government and the taxation, a vile monarch in Herod, who was an abusive leader, abusive and hard-hearted Pharisees and Sadducees. Oh yes, we know a lot about them, don't we? The Jews of that day were a people that were absolutely desperate to hope in something. And into really this mess of a world, the angelic hosts proclaimed on that beautiful night, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth, peace to those on whom his favor rests." And as I think about that, and I picture the manger and all that that entails, I have realized in time that peace is not a circumstance. Peace is not a circumstance. Peace is a person. Peace is a person. The God-man Jesus Christ, brothers and sisters, he is our peace. And without him, no amount of human effort or goodness can achieve this sense of world peace. Brothers and sisters, this world will tell you we want that peace, but it will not come on this earth. Even if we don't wage war, there will be always something that will remind us that we are not in heaven yet. We are not in heaven yet. But it is with Jesus Christ, that we behold the promises of God. Oh yes, for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Jews longed for their Messiah, and he was there, right there in that manger. The promise of God was kept. Jesus came to this earth. And God's providence in this story of Esther is the same providence that God shows through that incarnate Son in our lives. Sometimes, like the Jews residing in Persia, we are made all too well aware of our painful present. Oh yes, we just prayed about some of the pain that we are going through. The cancer, the pandemic, all of the things, that broken job situation, so many, the list is endless about the pain and the brokenness of our world. And in such a time, what can we do? We can cling to the first Advent. Oh yes, we put our hope in the second, when Jesus will come in victory, but we also we cling to that first Advent. I love these words from Pastor Ian Welcher. Reflecting on Jesus' birth, he encourages the church. Advent is the rusty nail holding us together until resurrection day. What will you hand your world-weary and bedraggled siblings in Christ, if not the hope of Advent? In that spirit, we hear these words, which we will soon sing together from a little town of Bethlehem. How silently the wondrous gift is given. So God imparts to human hearts the blessings of his heaven. No ear may hear his coming, but in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him still, the dear Christ enters in. And of course, right before those words, we hear, peace to men on earth. If Jesus is yours, there is no isolation, there is no pain, there is no pandemic that can overcome you. You are more than victorious. Why? Because you belong to Jesus Christ. And this life there is sorrow, but wait, because where we will go, the very promises of God are that there will be no sorrow, no tears, no pain. There will just simply be Jesus Christ in glory, and we will be with him forever. And so when we are reminded of the painful present, look to Jesus. Look at him lying innocently in that manger, and let him be your peace.